Hello and welcome to Pixel Driven, a YouTube channel all about learning Unreal Engine, specifically for automotive rendering. I'll be presenting these videos from the perspective of someone coming from a production background in Maya, and make an effort to draw parallels between the two programs. Part 2 of this video series will talk all about actors and assets in Unreal Engine. We'll cover a bit about project organization, as well as get a look at how to import assets into Unreal Engine from Maya. So we have our project open from part 1 here, and we've left off on our main level where we learned a little bit about level streaming. We learned a little bit about the UI in Unreal and how to make levels and a few other things here. So one of the really common themes in Unreal is working with assets and how they're represented as actors in your project. So let's talk a little bit about actors in Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine can be thought of as a stage, and everything on that stage is an actor. This cube, this plane, this light, these are all actors on the stage that we're in right now, or our level, which is main. So all of these actors, they'll play different roles in making up our scene. We have shapes, we have lights, we'll have materials later. These all kind of make up the content of our level. Actors in Unreal Engine can represent a multitude of different things here. So for example, we can go into our Place Actors panel and create a basic actor. And this, we pull this up and bring it back to the origin. You can see that this is just an empty actor. It's an instance of the class actor. It has a default scene root, which is something we'll learn about later. But otherwise, it's just completely empty. If we were to render this scene, there would be nothing here. This icon is really just to represent that there is an actor object there. And we can use this to add components to. That could be a piece of geometry or a light, anything that you want. An actor is kind of just like an empty null in Maya until you put something into it. So we'll delete that. So we'll look at our cube here. So the cube, if we look at this, when you hover over in the details panel here, you'll see that its class is static mesh actor. Its parent class is actor, and its mobility is static. So we'll learn a little bit more about mobility later, but for now, I would just keep in mind that for rendering still images and movies, and we're not making games, we're almost always going to set these to movable. We'll explain what that means a little bit later, but for the most part, if you're not making video games, you can set everything to movable. So this cube that we have here of class static mesh actor, it's referencing a static mesh in our project. So remember the magnifying glass here, if we click this, it's going to navigate us in our content drawer to where the actor that it's referencing lives. So we can see this cube of type static mesh. This is a static mesh asset at this point, not an actor. And it lives in the content folder under all engine content basic shapes. So this is engine content. These are things that are built into Unreal Engine. They weren't imported from some other project. This is just a part of the engine itself. And so this asset is being referenced into this actor. An actor will often reference an asset in your project, but not always. So if we look at our directional light here, you can see that directional light is of class directional light. Its parent class is light. It's currently set to stationary, so we can move that to movable. But it doesn't have a static mesh attribute. It doesn't have a skeletal mesh attribute. There's really nothing that it's referencing in the project here. If we scroll down through this, we won't find a magnifying glass icon to find it in our content browser. So this is really this is its own thing. This serves its own purpose. It has a function to light our scene. It's not referencing anything else in our project. It just has a direct effect in the level. So there's kind of two different branches of how actors can work. It's things that reference assets in the pipeline and things that are self-contained. So there's other examples of that in here. For example, under visual effects, we've got some different effects in here that will affect our scene. And we'll look at more of these in the lighting video, but things like a sky atmosphere, volumetric clouds, post-process volumes, we'll talk a lot about. This is very important for rendering in Unreal Engine. These things kind of are all self-contained, and they may or may not reference other assets in our project. So if we go up to our content folder here, we've also got these level assets here, and you can see at the bottom it's a type of level, right? So there's a few different names for levels in Unreal. You'll hear me call them scenes or levels or maps sometime. So if I hover over this in the tooltip, you'll see primary asset type is map. So there's a bunch of different names for levels in Unreal Engine. They're all kind of interchangeable. I usually stick to level as a naming convention for these because it's very clear at that point, and I can use it as a search key if I wanted to search and not use the filters here. So this is an asset type of level. If we look into the starter content folder here, there's a bunch of different assets that come in from that starter content. If we take a look in the audio folder, we'll see asset types of sound wave, sound cue. There's all kinds of different asset types in Unreal Engine that you can use to construct a project. If we look in the blueprints folder, there's going to be a blueprint class asset. HDR is going to have a texture cube asset, or in other words, an HDR. Maps is going to have several different levels in there. Materials, of course, has materials, and so on and so on. So this is stuff that is built into the engine here. What if we want to bring assets in from outside of Unreal? So we'll have to import things into Unreal, and there's a few different ways to do this. So let's go create an asset just to have something to work with here. So if I got Maya open, I'm just going to create a poly torus and make it nice and smooth. I'm going to delete history, freeze transformations on this so that we come into Unreal with no transform information. We'll learn more about the import and export processes into Unreal when we actually prep a car. We'll share a lot of good information about that there. But one thing that I wanted to point out here that is pretty different between Maya and Unreal is the up axis in Maya versus Unreal. So if we take a look at the default here in Maya, Maya has Y as the up axis. And if we go to the front view, we're looking at forward Z on this. All right, so the front view is pointing the direction of this blue arrow on our transform gizmo. So what we can do to make it really obvious for ourselves when we get this over into Unreal is just kind of select a portion of our object here, and we'll just flatten this out. Maybe pull this out a little bit. So it's a really ugly asset, but it'll give us a good idea of which direction Maya was pointing forward and then how that shows up in Unreal. So we'll make sure everything's all frozen down, and then we'll export this out as an FBX file. So I'm going to go to File, Export Selection, and I'm going to throw this onto my desktop, and I'm going to use just FBX export for now. So FBX. And there's documentation on Unreal's website about the supported formats for FBX and Unreal Engine. But just as kind of a quick hint on this, under FBX file format, I typically will set this to FBX 2013. In production, I've had the fewest issues with this, with exporting geometry, materials, rigs, that kind of thing. So we'll give this a name and just say torus asset and export. So we'll go back to Unreal here. I want to talk a little bit about project organization at this point. So we've got our content folder. There's everything that came in from the starter content here. And we've just started creating levels kind of at the root of our content folder here. it's a really good idea to start organizing things with folders. So I'm going to make a levels folder. I'll save everything, and then I'm going to move all of my maps or all my levels into this. So you might get warnings in Unreal when you start moving assets around. There's one thing that I like to do whenever I move assets in Unreal to different folders. There's a little function in the content browser here. If you right click a folder, so it used to be called fix up redirectors. It's now called update redirector references. So if you run this, it's going to perform some checks, and it'll say all references to redirectors were successfully updated. Then you've got an option to delete unreferenced redirectors or keep them. So typically after you run this, you can just delete the unreferenced redirectors and you should be good to go. So we'll go into our levels folder. Our main level that we made, our startup level in the last video, is now going to live inside game/levels main. So let's just double check if our project settings are still correct. So we go to maps and modes. So we can see this got cleared out when we moved those maps around. So this is something to watch out for in Unreal, is you can definitely break things pretty easily by moving assets around. And I've seen this happen in production so many times as people learn Unreal Engine for the first time and they start building projects. It's really easy to break things like this based on where the assets live in the project. So I'm going to reset this to the main level. So I'm going to just search for it here. There's only one level in our project called main, so I know it's the only one that I can find. That's the right one. And we'll do the same for the game default map. Okay, so we'll close that. Go back to my content folder, and I'm going to start creating other folders for different asset types. So I'm going to create a new folder and say, for example, imported assets. And then inside this folder, I'll make another new folder and we'll call this geometry. So if we want to import that FBX file, there's a couple of different ways to do that. One of the easiest ways is just to right click in the folder you want to import it into. And at the very top, say import to game/imported assets/geometry. This will bring up a file dialog here so you can find the asset that you want to import and say open. And this will give you the FBX import options dialog. So if we reset this to the default just to make sure this is the standardized default settings for Unreal, you'll see that says up at the top, import static mesh. So when you first click that import from the right click menu, it's going to take a look at the FBX file and kind of detect what it is. You know, if it's just a piece of geometry, polygon geometry, it'll most likely bring it in as a static mesh. If that file has a rig in it, it'll most likely bring it in with skeletal mesh checked here, and it'll start looking for the rig that's attached to that, the skeleton. But because this is just a polytorus, there's really not much in there. And we can pretty much just leave these at the default settings. And we'll see what happens if we import a object from Maya into Unreal without changing anything. So you can see it imported two assets here. There's a static mesh asset and a material asset. And this will be like the first time that we see other editors in Unreal Engine. So if you double click one of these, so like for example, if we double click the static mesh, we're going to open the static mesh editor and we can take a look at that asset, right? So we pulled those faces out here. We know that that is the direction that was facing forward in Maya. And we can see some information about this here. So this is a static mesh asset, or just a piece of geometry with no skeleton. And we can see in its details in the static mesh editor, it's got a lot of information here. So in the first sections here is for materials. We can see what materials are assigned to what elements on this object. So this object only has one material assigned to it. It's possible to do face assignments of materials in Maya and export those and import them into Unreal Engine. And you'll see those face assignments represented as different elements on the mesh and different materials that are assigned to them. Okay, so this asset, this FBX file, it imported a piece of geometry and it imported a material. And this is the material that it came in with. So element 0 has standard surface 1. If we look over back in Maya and we graph the materials that are on this object, we'll see that standard surface 1 is what was applied there. The thing that's a little bit strange is that we had a gray Lambert here that's actually not what came into Unreal Engine. I mean, that might be a little bit strange. What actually happened there in that FBX export is that this, in Maya 2025, the default material in Maya 2025 is an Arnold material. Now, it's no longer a Lambert like every other version of Maya that came before this. So the FBX file contains an Arnold shader for the material that's assigned to it, and Unreal doesn't know how to read an Arnold material. So it just kind of converts that material to something more generic and assigns a different color and everything along with it. So really the only thing that it kept was the name. So you'll find that in a lot of areas in Unreal, you'll see that assets can reference other assets. So one of the most common examples is a material that's assigned to a mesh. And you'll see it here, it'll have a swatch. You can double click swatches whenever you see them like this, and it'll open that asset. So now we're in the material editor, right? So you can see that in the graph here, you know, this is a material. We saw in the last video that there was a level blueprint editor that we were looking at for a moment that looks sort of similar. You can usually tell which one you're in, which graph you're in, by looking in the bottom right corner here. So we can see the material that got brought in, it's called standard surface. This is a standard Unreal material node, which we'll learn a lot more about in the next couple of classes. And it has one parameter that got plugged into it for base color. And I'm not really sure why it chose green as the color here. I don't know if there's any logic to that or if it's randomized every time, but it did not read what was in the FBX file. You can know that for certain. Okay, so we'll close these and we can bring this asset into our level by just clicking and dragging. So you can do this as many times as you want. And this is what I really wanted to get to here, but all of these actors that are living in our level, these are all referencing the same asset, right? So if we open this, and just for example, we'll open our material, and we're going to change something about our material, like make it red. Okay, we'll learn more details about materials in the next video, but just as a quick example, you'll see that all of these actors in our level all got updated because we updated the material that's assigned to this one asset. So you can kind of think as actors in your levels as referencing the assets that they contain, right? So if you wanted to make a unique version of this, you would need to duplicate this and make changes to it, or duplicate the material and make changes to that. So an actor references an asset. Multiple actors can reference the same asset, and we can override things about these assets in our levels. So you may be familiar with render layers or render setup in Maya. And one of the really common things that we do with those in production is override materials on things. So an actor in Unreal, you can do the same thing here. So as we saw in the static mesh editor, it has a material assignment, but the actor that contains this mesh in our level can have overrides, right? So for example, we're just going to duplicate this material and we're going to make this green again. Okay, so we'll save that. And so I'll select one of these meshes here. So say this one. And if I scroll down the details here, we'll see the static mesh that it's referencing and the material that's assigned to it by default, which is done in the static mesh editor. So this material slot can be overridden. And it's as simple as just dragging a new material onto it. So you can see that that one turned green. And if we scroll down to, there's a section in here for material override. And like I said in the last video, I typically will just search for these things. So you can see under rendering advanced override materials, there is at index 0, there's now standard surface 2. You can remove this override by hitting the U-turn button. So we'll hit that. It'll go back to being its original material. So we'll override it again. Hit the button to undo that or revert that to what's actually assigned in the asset. And you can assign different materials to things in this way. So with one asset, you can have many different representations of it, different copies with different materials in a single level or across different levels. The important thing to know is just actors will typically reference assets in your content browser. So I'm going to temporarily hide our cube there, and we'll take a look at our first torus here to take a look at what happened with scale, orientation. So you can see that in Unreal Engine, the up axis is the Z axis here, compared to Maya, the up axis being the Y axis. So Maya is up Y and forward Z. In Unreal, it's up Z and forward X. So if we look through our orthographic views here and look through our top view, we can see, first of all, that our object is not centered at the origin. So let's reset that. And take a look at what we have. So we'll go back to perspective. And we'll take a look at the front view. So looking through the front view, you can see that that piece that we extruded off in Maya is pointing off to the side, whereas in Maya, it's pointing right at us. So when we look through Unreal, this is the view that we get if we kind of translate that in Maya. So in Unreal, it wants to be pointing forward X like this. All right, so we'll rotate that 90 degrees. We'll freeze our transformations on this, and then we'll export a new version of this. So we'll call this oriented. Export selection. We'll come back into Unreal here, and we'll import that new FBX file. Import all. We'll save all of these. And so if we go into our perspective view and we add this oriented version of our torus to our level, we'll see that it is now facing the correct direction for Unreal. So we go up to our perspective view and look through the front. It is actually now pointing the right direction, right? So the X axis, that piece that we extruded off, is pointing that direction. Perfect. So it's just kind of a thing that you'll need to get used to when working between Maya and Unreal, is just making sure that, for the most part, the only thing you need to make sure that you do is make your objects face forward on the X axis. So one little trick that I do in Maya to make that a little bit easier for myself is, so if I go to the orthographic front view, it's going to look a little bit weird. You can actually use the view cube here to orient this a different way. So I'll turn this until I know that that's facing forward. And now the x-axis will act like our front axis on our orthographic view in Maya. So go back to the front. It'll be oriented the same way that we expect to see in Unreal. Unreal does automatic conversion for the up axis for you, so you don't need to worry about fixing that. And I'd actually kind of recommend against changing the up axis in Maya, because that is possible. If you go to settings and preferences, there is a way to change the up axis here in Maya. So here under settings and preferences, settings, there's world coordinate system. By default, it's up axis Y. You can change it to Z. I've found that changing it to Z to solve that problem, it does some weird things. It's better to let FBX just handle the translation in Unreal. So we've talked a lot about assets and actors in here. I wanted to keep this one a little bit shorter than the last video and just really kind of give a brief overview of how assets and actors work in Unreal and just get you thinking about the whole actors on the stage thing. So we'll expand on this a little bit more with different types of assets in Unreal in the next couple of videos. We're going to dive into materials in the next one here. So thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.